Okay, the Conquistadors. And this is the review portion of the whole installments. I don't have to tell most of you that because it's labeled as such and whatnot. But just as a reminder of the way I do things, because I've gotten over the years, but recently more than usual, a few comments of like, wow, this review didn't tell me anything about how the game is played or anything. Yeah, that's in the introduction section. The structure of my coverage is always centered around the playthrough, even though that's the least watched portion of my video. The introduction gives you what most reviews seem to spend most of their time on, which is giving an overview of the game, maybe some of the mechanisms in play. Then I revisit those mechanisms, usually in the first playthrough, fairly heavily, looking into how they actually operate. Although throughout the entire playthrough, I do examine as new things show up, as new aspects of the game show up. This review, like all my reviews, is usually more, it's sort of a mixed bag. It's a review of the game itself and maybe a little bit of my play experience. And I really shouldn't, there's no reason I'm singling this out to say all that, except that, people who are newer to the channel might want to hear that. But, what's the chance that this is the particular game that they get that information of as opposed to anything else in my rather vast output. Okay, to begin with, so I approached this with a lot of excitement. In fact, the reason I bought it was because I was very excited about the idea of a very narrative game reflecting that the actual operations of the Conquistadors themselves. And in that I was disappointed. The narrative aspects of the game are very, very low. It focuses much more on a sort of a player competition, take that type play through the use of these cards. There is a fair amount of luck in the game nonetheless. But as someone gets ahead, they start attracting all the really bad stuff, because the really bad stuff is generally controlled by player actions rather than by anything that, rather than a response of the system as a whole to what a player does. It's by other players generating mal-events upon the people that they wish to hit. So unless there's some sort of antagonism going on, that if people are playing it very competitively, it will always kind of flow towards causing problems for the people who are doing the best. The solitaire game's a little different. I haven't played that, but it, instead of relying on other players to take down the leader, it does generate a sort of a more random and I would say more narrative-friendly version of events coming up. Unfortunately, there's a certain, generosity, if that's a word, I think it is, to how those events happen. So it's like, hey, there's, some natives show up and attack you and whatnot. So in terms of what I was hoping for from the game, it really didn't generate what I was hoping for. We'll get more into that, I think, later. All right, let's dive into components, because that might help get me flowing towards other things. It's generally the least important thing in a game, but really, really bad components can screw up a game. Even if it's just they're physically unattractive looking, it reduces the pleasure of the game. In this game, the components are very, very physically attractive, in my opinion. So you have the boards, and there's two of them. They need not all come into play, but I'll unfold the smaller one. Nice hard board. Really, really nice color scheme on it. I don't I'm not a big fan of bubble maps, but they do make play easier in a lot of ways. Although the limited space, counters, will sit covering all the important information, where an area-based game could leave you room to have counters in more spaces. However, that's a pretty minor disagreement. The only thing with the bubble maps that I don't really like, they give this sort of, they give you a connected graph rather than some as the space that you're playing on. They give you an abstraction of what would be present in an area game, and that abstraction does away with some of the sort of ability to visualize what's going on and becomes more of a, hey, this simplifies things for play because everything's the same size and everything is represented the same way. But it does give, again, sort of reduces the impact of how that visual information is processed in terms of linking you to what the subject matter of the game is. But given that decision, really, really well done there in terms of that. The cards, so physically the cards are very, very good. Much more shuffleable than I feared. I found they had a lot of flex to them. That's important because there's a fairly large deck, not a huge one, but one that requires a decent amount of shuffling several times during play. About every other turn, although both the first and second turns you have to do shuffling. So there's a fair amount of shuffling. The actual, getting a little away from the components there, because we can never stay on point, right? The actual usage of the cards in play does present a bit of complexity in terms of the way that you draw and deal and stock your hand each turn is mechanically intensive. You're allowed to discard, more mental, mechanical, and this is probably not a big deal in an opposed playing, which the game is frankly meant for. I mean, what I do with games is kind of odd, to be honest. I try to play multiplayer games, solitaire. But what you have to do is you have to discard a bunch of cards that you don't want, freeing up space in your hand. Then you draw your hand up to 10 cards, and then you discard 2 of those cards. So there's a lot of steps to preparing your hand, which isn't such a big deal if you're just playing one hand, but when you're playing 5 of them like I was, it does get in the way. The counters themselves, again, they're lovely in appearance. They're good, hard, heavy stock. Really, really nice. Didn't require any kind of trimming or clipping, except, if you screw something up minor. But from a design perspective, they don't really, they actually get in the way of playing the game properly. Beautiful as they are, there are color issues that I found it difficult to distinguish pieces from one another. There are pieces that don't have things that should be back printed on them. It's not a matter of oh my God, I absolutely have to change this counter, except that when you're trying to absorb the information that's on the board, you can't get it all. You're going to have to flip counters over where you shouldn't have had to and stuff like that. So those get really in the way. Also, the actual Conquistador counters are colored by the type of Conquistador there are. There's going to be 3 different types that show up throughout the game. There's ones that are basically first top tier Conquistadors, and those are the ones that you pull at the beginning of the game, right? Then there's sort of second tier ones, which might be available to you at the beginning of the game after all the top tier ones are used up. And then in the second turn of the game, all the top tier and second tier ones are available to be chosen from for a second Conquistador that each player is allowed to get. And finally, there's a set that's replacement Conquistadors who really kind of suck. There are people who didn't do much, but were associated with various expeditions. And these are going to be ones that, you're not going to recognize many of the names. They're sort of an infinite quantity, which is to say if one dies, he just goes back in the deck and becomes available again. by choosing to color code them by that, the counters that are in play in the game by that, what it means is that there's no easy way of identifying, hey, is this my piece? Right? You have to do an alignment between the Conquistador card itself, which these are marked strategy cards, but they're not actually. They're the Conquistador cards, but they get shuffled into the strategy deck in order, any excess ones after the first two sets are picked get shuffled into the deck on turn 3 and then become available and are kind of a big random bonus to people who can get them. Maybe. It depends. I had players in my game who did not who generated additional conquistadors that they basically didn't use, and certainly most of the players didn't get many points off those additional conquistadors, although they could have just used them as reinforcements for their current expedition. I already said I'm not really thrilled with the dice. They look fine. I didn't even take them out of the package because these are just not the kind of dice I want to use for this kind of game, and I can't think of a game that I would use these dice for. There's nothing terribly wrong with them. If all my dice were like this, I wouldn't know any different, but I picked ones that I feel fit component-wise better for any given game. And like I said, someday I may try to scrounge through my dice and say, hey, I use these for this, and I use these for this, and I feel funny if I'm using the wrong dice for sort of the visual effect of the game, whatever that has to do with anything, and it's just weirdness. I don't think there was a sequence of play outside the rule book, so I had to write one up. Not a big deal. It's not a very complex sequence of play. Very quickly you memorize it. This is often the case with games, but I mean, I was away from the game a lot, and I still didn't really need this, although I did screw up a couple of times just because that's how I am. Player aid tables contain, there's 2 sets of two sheets each, which is sufficient for all the players in the game to be able to access what they need. Somebody can be examining, a particular card or both cards if they wish, while somebody who's playing their turn has cards available to them too. It's a nice touch. I'm always in favor of giving more, even if I don't really need them. The rule book itself is glossy, which, if you know me, I do not like. It creates a glare with my lighting situation. Lighting is not always good for gaming in most places you go. So a matte finish is always better, but also, even more importantly for me, if you put something on glossy paper like this, you kind of have to get it 100% right and not make any errors, because it's very hard to write errata. And even before it got sent out, get on a glossy page. I really don't know why this one is glossy, but okay. I mean, I know glossy paper is cheaper when you do larger scale printing, but I don't really think it is when you do single sheets. So it's probably they actually spent extra to create this on a glossy sheet. But this is the errata that was available before shipping and whatnot. There is significantly more errata, I think 3 to 4 pages, that's online right now in electronic form. Much of it probably could be written into the rule book if you had the capability to write it in with pencil. Nothing really takes to glossy paper except for things like Sharpies. So, and then and this happened a lot with, say, like the gamers with their more complex games, if something is written as an errata and then it gets withdrawn or changed or something, you gotta scribble out your errata and rewrite it, because you can't erase like you can with a pencil. In addition, you can't write any kind of notes, little ideas that you have for, hey, this would be a good way to do this that I think would work better. Again, an important factor, because quite honestly, the rules were not fully developed. There's no developer mentioned in the credits. I always see that as a big red flag. I usually don't check it until I start running into problems in the game. And when I start running into problems, and in this case it was with the counter mix, where I'm like, gee, I wonder, why the developer didn't catch this. The problems are bad enough that I can't believe that the playtest copies could have possibly been as susceptible to them. Because, quite honestly, I'm not going to say the game's unplayable, but it's a definite burden on the players to deal with some of the production issues. Now, I do have to say that's a common factor with Compass games. Compass games quite often don't seem to have a good graphical design view behind them. So I wasn't shocked to find that. I had to mark up some of my counters in order to make them distinguishable. Again, not an absolute necessity. If you've got perfect lighting and the ability to see through counters, the backside that's facing the board, maybe you wouldn't need that. There were a couple of places where the rules didn't quite align with the charts or didn't align with some things in the cards. There were things in the cards that appear to be artifacts that either did... It's hard to tell which way it was intended, but that didn't make it into the rule book. A couple of kind of important things that, like, I pull a card and I'm like, oh, is that how it's supposed to be played? Now, I'm not great at remembering and getting all the rules right on a playing, even of games that I'm used to playing, but here I'm playing something for the first time. So I go and look back, and I can't find any indication of what the card is kind of referring to. So again, development problems in the whole game. But let's put that aside and talk about the actual play of the game, what it's going to get and what it's going to give you. Like I said, the cards are a big focus of the game. It's not a CDG. You're not looking at cards that allow you to either do something or trigger an event, to spend points or trigger an event. Each card is sort of an event type thing. Some of them, and you don't need them to be able to do stuff. You have things that you can do every turn. It's an impulse-based game where you pretty much activate one of your expeditions to do a task, and you're allowed to play as many of these sort of action cards as you like. The action cards might help your circumstances. Some of the strategy cards, and I'm not sure that they're action cards, allow you to influence activities that you're taking. Those might be reaction cards that you play on yourself. I don't really recall how they're stated. I think they're put as action cards. Some of the cards say action card on them when really they're reaction cards, or at least can be used as such by the way the card seems to appear to be worded. Again, up to interpretation, development problems behind the game. But yeah, like I said, there's sort of this mechanical pain in the ass aspect, especially playing multiplayer solo, of creating your hands every turn. And there are a fair amount of reshuffles behind that. Beyond that, what the cards allow you to do is they've got very much... So there's, like I said, there's cards that help you, and then there's sort of reaction cards, and then there's combat cards. The reaction cards allow you to impact what other people are doing. If somebody's in the middle of an action, you can give them a modifier that makes it bad, makes it worse for them. You also have some of your action cards which directly impact other people. Things like this arrest warrant that you can just play on somebody and cause them problems. What that means, and I think I alluded to this earlier, is that a lot of the play of the game focuses on this kind of take that type functionality. It's a great mechanism for sort of allowing people to catch up, and it can be a lot of fun in my experiences in terms of as an antagonism builds up between a couple of players. Maybe one of them can't win anymore, so they just start focusing on screwing somebody who put them in the position they're in for the rest of the game, or whatever. And it gets much, much worse if people have come to some sort of agreement and somebody breaks it. That becomes even more of that kind of nature. Since there's so much capability to level badness on other players, you want, you end up with a sort of a play that is much more about taking people down who are in the lead if you're playing very competitively. And I think that's sort of the way the game is supposed to be played. And that gets in the way of the narrative. The narrative is not, it doesn't align with what you'd expect out of reality. People who are doing well are going to have something terrible happen to them. Karma's a bitch in this game. People who are getting bad luck, well, they'll have less bad things happen because nobody wants to screw them over. There's also significant difference in terms of, say, the quality of the conquistadors that you can take. There's a couple, Pizarro and Cortez, who are just really, really good compared to all the rest. That seems tremendously unbalancing, and it would be if it weren't for that take-that nature of the card play and the ability to level more difficulties on the better conquistadors until you kind of even things up of that initial. There's also, in the standard game, as opposed to the basic game, the game is divided into two. There's not a lot of difference between them, but one of the big differences is in the basic game, everybody starts on the board already with a little enclave of stuff they've discovered, and then they operate from there. In the standard game, you start out in one of the initial ports, and you roll up sort of a random amount of money that you're allowed to build your expedition from. And you can use that money directly for your expedition. You can take out additional loans equal to that money, which is usually, I think, a good idea because you want some meat to your expedition, otherwise it falls apart really quickly. However, the rolls could be very low, and what that's going to mean is that you start off with, if they're really low, too small an expedition, but you're more likely to end up with just a difference in the amount of debt that you have, and that debt is sort of a victory point penalty that you have to overcome as you play the game by spending gold. Each impulse, each turn, the order of play is completely randomized. This is a good thing, I guess, because there are some small cases where players on the board can be grabbing stuff and doing stuff ahead of someone else where it has some impact. Much more, and if there's an arrest warrant in play, hunting people becomes a possible avenue for hurting them. I didn't see a hell of a lot of it. We had one engagement where there was an attempt, and it didn't really go well for either of them, because what you've got is them fighting each other instead of fighting the system to try to gain value for themselves. For the most part, the initiative doesn't mean much. It might affect the psychological aspects of, I'm going to play all my nasty cards right at the beginning, against the guy who goes first. But there's plenty of time over the course of a turn, and I think as you get kind of familiar with the game, you start to learn to reserve your bad stuff for the people you want to actually hit. And it's okay that you maybe don't hit the right people on the first couple turns until you get a better feel of what the pace of what the cycle of the game is, because again, there's plenty of time to catch up. In fact, the game that I played, it looked like one person was running away with the game. Someone else ended up winning. There's a random events phase that seems kind of odd with all the cards and everything in it, but yeah, it allows some sort of broad occurrence that can have some impact on the game. They don't tend to be too impressive for the most part. They're not going to really rule the game as much as your luck in discoveries and your luck in card draws, your manipulation of the cards, and how people target one another. Those are going to have a whole lot more influence. Then we go into an individual impulse segment where there's a variable number of impulses. As more and more happen, the turn becomes more and more likely to just end. They feel like, well, I don't know. They feel very small. Like each individual impulse feels very small. A turn doesn't feel like you're doing massive things. But honestly, at the scope of the game, where you're looking at, really just what were a few months of activity in most cases for most of these conquests or operations, whatever you want to say. The whole game is presenting what are really a number of characters, periods of a few months, maybe a year or two, well, maybe up to 5 years of activity over the whole thing. And, you've got big slices of territory that you're operating in. So I think that the timing works well there. What doesn't work, and it's something I brought up in the wrap-up, is that most of these conquistadors were not operating at the same time. This is not a bunch of stuff that was happening concurrently, but that's what the game gives a view of, that everything's happening at sort of the same time when really there were years in between. It's a 30-year period of conquistadors being covered in the game, and each of them is operating for maybe 3 to 5 years max, in terms of the activities that they're taking in the game. And they're just not doing them concurrently historically. So you get a completely kind of skewed view of what, this whole period is like. During your actual play in the impulses, you can basically activate one of your expeditions or some hostile Indians. There are some cards that allow you to activate a second expedition. And I think the way the card is worded, it's only if you're activating a single expedition. You could house rule that, or maybe it was intended that you're able to do hostile Indians and an expedition. I actually see some advantages to not doing it that way. The reason you would use those cards is if you have 2 different expeditions on the map. But there's big negatives to having 2 expeditions operating at the same time. So you may really not want to do that. And then those cards become kind of questionable entirely on that. Some of the other things that you can... So in the impulses, you basically can move, maybe get a fight out of that, or do some diplomacy, some plundering, rallying your forces, whatever. The thing is, you're only allowed to do one of these actions, for the most part, in each of your impulses. And what that means is that, you're constantly being faced with these challenging choices, and there aren't a lot of impulses in the turn. I don't remember what the numbering worked out to. So there can be they can go on infinitely long, but there's probably like maybe 5 impulses in the average turn. And you might want to move a space and explore something. You need to get some food on each turn because you're going to face some problems if you don't have food. You will have to try to position yourself so you're not in bad territory at the end of each turn. Number of stuff like that. And because you don't know how long the turns are going to last in terms of impulses, you might find yourself stuck in the bad places or in a bad situation just because you chose to do things in an order that, was not optimal had you known the number of impulses there were, but you were maybe taking a chance or something. Maybe there was something more important for you to do. Just because of the, I don't know, just because of the possible impacts it might have on other players' decisions, I guess, more than anything else. And because you know that they don't have any cards that can hurt you in that way. However, knowing those things, yeah, you've got to prioritize and you've got to kind of make your decision. Hey, do I need to do this before the end of the turn? Is this more important, or can I risk a morale check because I don't have food or something? That it works out pretty nicely. You know, it gives you some hard choices to make, maybe, but they're not terribly difficult. You're not agonizing over them. Usually, it's pretty easy. In fact, it gets so easy sometimes that you just forget about things that you really shouldn't have forgotten about. And that's kind of cool too, because it creates these kind of, I think in multiplayer, you know, if you're playing this opposed with other people at the table, I think it'll create some humor and, you know, some laughing experiences that I associate with other games that kind of remind me of this. I gotta say, some of them aren't based on the what did you choose to do and what can somebody else do to you, in the same way as this is. But, you know, whatever. It's just, it provides that same sort of energy. And a couple of the games that I referred to a lot while I was playing were Source of the Nile and Geronimo, for various different reasons. Source of the Nile, because you're wandering around there exploring stuff, bad shit happens to you. It's much more narrative based, kind of dull because it's almost all luck based. There aren't a lot of decisions that you... There are some false choices in the game, but there aren't a lot of decisions that once you've played the game a little bit, you're really forced to choose among in quite the same way as you are here. And Geronimo, because of that, take that nature of the way the cards work in that game. And both of those provide that kind of experience. I think this one would as well. It's hard to tell because I haven't played it opposed. And chances are, in my life now, I probably never will. It's simply, you know, I don't know. I've made some attempts to get gaming going here, but it just feels like the chances of any particular game in my collection getting played are low, and I'm more likely to bring something that I'm really familiar with over the years as providing a fun experience, rather than, oh, I just got this. Here's the one exception. If I was gaming right now, like if I had a group that was coming every week, having just played this, I would actually want to bring it to the table, because I do like this. I think I would enjoy the opposed play of the game. It's sort of, you know, a bigger scale, but one of the things I kind of gripe about is so much of it is focused on the card play and whatnot. The card play and the, you know, just doing nasty shit to each other with cards. That's basically how you're impacting other people. Very little, I think, in terms of like actually interfering with them, in terms of my expeditions doing something that directly impacts you. What that ends up meaning is I think it'll be less exciting on that nature than Geronimo shows up as, but certainly more exciting in that sort of competitive and targeting type of atmosphere than Source of the Nile is, where you have almost no impact on anyone else, except if your paths kind of cross and you find things near one another. Oh, so in addition to your one operation you can take, and as your choice there, you could instead decide to pick a bunch of hostile Indians and attack someone else with them, including moving them. Very few times I saw that done. Usually the hostile Indians sit there because, honestly, the Conquistadors can usually beat them up. They might take some harm from it, though. But yeah, very seldom does it appear that there's a chance of wiping out an entire expedition. I don't think that happened. That did not happen at all in my game. There were a couple of times when it looked like it might. In addition to being able to do that sort of one action, you have a bunch of free stuff you can do. Playing strategy cards for their actions. Dividing up gold. You can take... This is in the standard game only. In the basic game, you do something like just convert gold to victory points. The dividing up gold is sort of this kind of obnoxious mechanical process that extends the length of the game because you get less victory points per gold that you find, but it also imposes a surcharge based on the size of your expedition in terms of how much victory points you get for the gold. And that's sort of the biggest deal in the standard game, is that there's this additional surcharge, and that additional surcharge favors you for having a smaller expedition, having less conquistadors in any given expedition. You can also throw gifts to the governor, which can affect, the chance of these warrants coming out. It also affects your victory points, the chances of getting good starting money for a new expedition. That's a little screwed up because after about turn 4, I don't think anyone's going to be starting new expeditions because all the cards are gone by that point. You could hold on to a card all game. Doesn't, at least in the 5-player game. Now, in a smaller number of players, those extra conquistadors are going to last you more turns. It took me, 10, 11 turns to get through the whole game. So there's a fair, in a smaller number of players, there may be a fair amount of time that you have to bring in these new conquistadors. You'll get a lot more of them in your hand and have to make choices more. In 5 players, you don't get very many. So you get your 2 starting ones, and then you're kind of lucky if you get another one. More than half the people get the other one, but yeah, you want to make sure you play it. It might be that you don't really care that much and throw conquistadors away in like a 3-player game. I don't know. Didn't do it. One of the things in your movement is exploration. And exploration is kind of a funky operation. Failing to light my pipe. Lots and lots of charts, lots and lots of little luck-based things. But you play on this like discovery based on the number of the space on the map. And you see these range 0 to 4 for places that you can explore. And those are marked on here. But depending on what else has already been discovered next to a space, you might get penalized in terms of trying to find something else. And it might even be that you cannot find certain kinds of things that you absolutely need to find based on that. Which means you make some really weird choices in terms of pushing on. Now, these can be explained in terms of how the actual exploration is being undertaken. Hey, I walked into a swamp. There doesn't appear to be anything here. I don't think there's any civilization here. Screw it. I'm not going to keep pushing on in this direction. When there might be something just on the other side of the swamp that's huge and big, but you shouldn't go there. Because if you go there directly from, a place where there isn't any kind of settlement already, you're not going to find a big settlement, and you're heavily penalized. On the other hand, if you find another route around, you might find that that location actually does contain something which it wouldn't contain if you pushed the other way. Feels like the wrong kind of cause and effect, but in terms of and this is honestly where I like the design for effect. I don't know if I like it. It always grates on me, but it does the right thing. Once you're used to it, once you know how the game operates, you don't push on in a direction where there's nothing present, because you're just going to be screwing the world up in that area. You're going to make it worse. Now, there are ways around that. There are cards that allow you to undiscover a space so that you can discover it again once things are set up better, which may be an interesting option as well. So that actually enforces the proper behavior, but only on players who who understand how these charts are going to operate. You could very much do the wrong, play the game wrong and get terrible results that are unacceptable because of that. Like they don't make sense anymore. Anyway. After all the impulses are done, that's done again by random chance at the end of each. Once all the players have gone in an impulse, you roll dice to see if the impulse ends. You automatically get a couple of them. Then you hit a subsistence phase where you have to feed everybody, and you have to be carrying food with you to do that, unless you're near a port near or in a port or allied city. And I think I've got that right. I might be wrong. You may not be able to do it next to a port. And then if you happen to be sitting in a spot that's malaria impacted, which is mosquito spaces and then, the rainforests, you have to make a check for that. And both starvation and malaria are handled the same way. You make a quick roll on a morale check table, and you might lose some pieces, but most likely you're going to take morale hits. Once you take enough morale hits, you start losing pieces due to your low morale. Finally, you make a victory check. Now, your victory points are going to be combined of two things. Well, a few things, let's say. One major thing, the main way you get your victory points, is you collect up gold. I seem to be explaining too much of the game instead of giving just opinions here. Collecting up the gold in the basic game is you have to, stow away 75 victory points, which is basically 75 gold. In the standard game, you have to have stowed away that much gold minus the expenses, the levy. The king takes a fifth of your money, and then the size of your expedition reduces your money. You also can get points off of the governor. There's a few bonus points out there. Finding the First Empire is worth like 5, which is tiny because you need 75 in the basic game. You need 200 in the standard game. 200 is a lot, but if it's not that high, some early bad luck could really make it impossible for you to catch up. Whereas what I found in my playing was the person who kind of got screwed the earliest, got screwed in terms of not finding a good pillageable location for a long time. They were actually able to win. So that's pretty impressive in terms of the catch-up capability there. You can also get victory points off of how much the governor likes you, and you can lose them off of that. And finally, there are these legends. And these are things like the Fountain of Youth and El Dorado, El Diablo, and the 7 cities of Ciabola, and stuff like that. Prester John, but also things that are real, like the Amazon and Mississippi rivers. And these can be worth huge amounts of points, like 60 points for a full discovery, but it's really, really unlikely for you to get a full discovery, especially for things that don't actually exist. But they might. One of the things that happens is when you plunder and when you ask for gold more nicely, little markers show up on the map saying, for that particular city, saying, hey, you've taken a lot of their gold. And eventually, cities become plundered out, and you can't take gold from them anymore. One of the big things I learned was that most of your victory points come from gold, and most of your gold comes from violently taking that gold. Asking for it doesn't get you much. Asking less nicely gets you a lot. And, after playing it once, I think I could shorten the game by being more aggressive in some of my operations. There are times when you feel like you can't do anything because of things being pointed out. My overall feeling of it is I am saddened by the lack of sort of that narrative connection. I definitely hoped to have something that gave me a better picture of what's happening in terms of these great conquests. But I do think, and this is why I say, if I had a regular group, this would be hitting the table to let them play and experience it. I do think it would be kind of fun in that take that sort of nature. At times, I compared it to, hey, why not just fucking play Uno? And yeah, you can get a lot of that kind of fun off of normal card games, off of much, much lighter games than this. And I'm not sure how much else this really reveals. It doesn't give you a good historical understanding because of the weird compressing all the conquistadors' actions into being in the same very small slice of time, in terms of the narrative being gone, in terms of I don't know, just a number of things. A lack of you know, like a paragraph system type game would give you much richer sort of play in terms of giving you a story and everything, where everything didn't feel so generic. A lot of this feels very generic, and it just there's not special characteristics to the given empires and whatnot. They're just all the same. They're just sources of money, and they all operate in the same way. It's all very kind of simple. The way what a city allies to you, what that means. It's all very standard. Every city operates the same way in that way, which gives it kind of this tasteless feel, which is definitely not what I was hoping for. And again, something like Geronimo manages to give you a lot more flavor because each of the different tribes there has its own characteristics to some extent or another. Here, those characteristics are really only just what chits did you pull out of the cup for the troops that they have when they're aggressive against you. I would much rather some cards and whatnot, or maybe a random event or something like that, to determine sort of the nature of the stuff you find, rather than just, village, town, city, imperial. And the empires are all kind of very much the same. All the cities and villages are all just the same. It's all just, all too similar. All the same, it's kind of neat to bring something like this, but I don't feel like it really accomplishes anything that I really wanted it to. I'm assuming it did what the designer wanted to. It got published, man, he was willing to release it. But yeah, for me, it feels kind of just like, wow, this could have shown quite a bit of promise, but no real attempt was made here. It's kind of weird because the designer is the same one who put out Carrier. Now, that's a game that is incredibly heavily respected. It also did, if I'm not mistaken, the Tokyo Express, another solitaire game. Carrier and Tokyo Express are both solitaire. Both are very respected. Carrier more so, but maybe just because more copies were sold and whatnot, and more people experienced it. Which is just this really detailed solitaire examination of carrier operations during World War II. And from my point of view, that game also didn't hit, but it didn't hit from the other side. There was just too much burden, but also on something that I'm just not that interested in. And that's, one of the issues there. And I was kind of excited about, what that kind of mind could bring to an exploration of, this particular aspect. But honestly, I don't feel like the Conquistador parts of this, just to pull another game that I mentioned a number of times, from Age of Exploration, the game Age of Exploration by Tim Jim, if I'm getting it right. I keep calling it that. I'm not absolutely certain. I got it right there. I'll go look. I think that's what it's called. Yeah, that's what it is. This doesn't feel like it's given, much more flavor than that is. And what that kind of tracks the entire Conquistador operation if you're undertaking that. And this is in a much bigger scope. It's handling exploration. You can look for the Northwest Passage, and you can march looking for the rivers and stuff in more detail than in this. But the Conquistador aspect of it is, oh, look, there's a track, and you want to advance a certain number of spaces on the track. Feels kind of like Churchill in terms of that, in terms of, how much the military is operating in Churchill. Well, that's how Age of Exploration's Conquistador track works. This gives more detail, but I don't feel like the narrative's any richer, simply because of the sort of, again, flavorless aspect of it, which is a big disappointment, honestly. However, I don't think it's a terrible game. I just had much, much higher hopes for it than are being expressed here. Yeah. So, I'm going to pull something up I've had a long time that I keep promising myself I'm going to do. Didn't clip the counters for it, not going to clip them. It's a simple game, but I want to see how it operates, and it's one I wanted to do a long time ago. Then I have a couple of review copies that I really have to get to. The one that I've read the rules for, I'm not as excited about anymore. It looks like it's just a Euro. And then someday I'll get back to the Talavera part of the NBS. In terms of my videos, I was exploring the idea of trying to monetize them, not because I need the cash, but because that gets you more viewership. If something is demonetized for any reason whatsoever, and mine are just inherently so, because I chose not to monetize them, it gets a lot less promotion. And that makes sense, because YouTube doesn't make money off of what I do particularly. But then, one, it required something I'm not willing to do, which is basically have a phone in order to link my account to that. It might be possible. I might be able to get a security token to do it, and in that case, maybe I'll explore it. But then the other thing that pissed me off about it was apparently YouTube is starting to crack down more and more on salty language. And, I don't think you can make it through one of my videos without hearing at least one fuck. So, because I got a lot of fucks to give in that nature, none in the other. Anyway, just thought I'd catch you up on shit like that because, well, this is my social life, man. Up it goes. I forgot to mention that I really should. The box. The box is a really nice armored box. I probably said that in my intro, but Compass is putting out much, much better boxes. This is a really good trend as far as I'm concerned. So many of my old games, especially my Avalon Hill stuff, the boxes are kind of falling apart. But it's nice to see some heavy effort put into these. When those games first came out, there's the old Conquistador, there's Age of Exploration there. There's one that I gotta get to at some point. Yeah, those old boxes from the 70s and 80s, especially these poor flat boxes. I should store them on their side, but now so many of them have fallen apart. I don't think anybody really realized that people would be holding on to and playing these games, 50 years later? 60 in some cases? Damn, man.